In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Swinging Sixties. Make sure you're on page 4 of your interactive notebook. The 1960s kicked off with a presidential election. Two candidates faced off: Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, and John Kennedy, the Democratic candidate. In 1960, we saw the first live televised presidential debate, which was a big deal. As you can see in the picture at the top on the TV, Kennedy stood out. He was youthful. He was talking to the camera. He really appealed to the American public for the way in which he presented himself on camera. Nixon, on the other hand, was shifty. He evaded the camera. He was clammy. He was nervous. And he really looked like the weaker candidate on TV. People who were polled afterwards, those who watched the televised debate said Kennedy won hands down. And those who listened to it, possibly on the radio, said that Nixon won hands down. So it really sparked a change in the way in which presidential candidates used media, broadcast, or print media to present themselves to the American public. In 1960, Kennedy and his running mate, Lyndon Johnson, do go on to win that election. They narrowly defeat Nixon. And Kennedy becomes the youngest president ever elected at the age of 43. While in office, his domestic policy that he set out to put forth was known as the New Frontier, which really symbolized not only his youth, but the youth of the American public. Some of the programs domestically he would go on to support included Medicare, civil rights, education, the Peace Corps, the economy, so on and so forth. Something else that he focused on, and he poured a great deal of time and effort into, was the space race. In the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had launched a satellite nicknamed Sputnik, and once that came into the atmosphere, the American public was a little bit on edge because they didn't know what that would bring, but it also energized them to get their own satellite into space. JFK announced during his presidency that America would be the first nation to put a man on the moon. By 1962, the astronaut John Glenn becomes the first man to orbit the moon, the American astronaut John Glenn. And by 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin do walk on the moon, fulfilling JFK's promise to the American public and the space race. The space race was also really important because it also provided new technology. The idea of satellites roaming space, think about today, all the technology that we have. This really paved the way to some of the things that we have and we kind of take for granted these days. Foreign policy, Kennedy was strongly opposed to communism as well as the rest of the United States, and they pledged to constrain the spread of communism like other presidents had. This policy becomes known as containment, the idea of containing communism to where it already was, and we don't want to spread it even further. One of his biggest challenges came from Cuba, and there's two places that he got involved, and he got into a really sticky situation. First was the Bay of Pigs invasion that occurred in 1961. President Roosevelt, who came not too long before Kennedy, had wanted to overthrow the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, who had seized power on his own. And so Kennedy picks up with that, rolls with it, and decides to try to carry out that plan. They wanted to train Cuban exiles to basically overthrow Fidel Castro. So they trained these exiles, they invaded Cuba, but unfortunately they were defeated by the Cuban military, and it becomes a huge Kennedy becomes a huge laughingstock. It shows that he might be too young to be president, he doesn't know what he's doing, lack of leadership, so on and so forth. So it's a real stain or a tarnish on Kennedy's presidency. Fast forward to 1962, we have what becomes known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is probably the closest the United States and another nation ever got close to nuclear war, other than the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan in World War II. With the Soviet Union and the United States, this is the closest they ever came to possibly creating nuclear warfare. So in 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered Cuba was secretly preparing missile sites for nuclear weapons that were provided by the Soviet Union. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro was very upset with the United States, so he decided to align himself with the Soviet Union. He and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, drew up this alliance, and like I said, he was preparing missile silos on the island of Cuba. JFK orders a naval blockade around Cuba to try and prevent the spread of even more missile sites. And why this was a big deal is because of the location or the proximity of Cuba to the United States. Cuba was about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Not only is the nation very close, but these missiles that they were developing, they had missiles, they're called intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. And so they had long-range missiles and they had short-range missiles. And as you can see from the diagram, a short-range missile could reach almost as far as Washington, D.C., and a long-range missile could reach as far as into Canada, or all the way to like Salt Lake City, much of the Midwest. So it was a real threat not far from United States borders, and it became a very tense few days. The Cuban Missile Crisis actually only lasted for 13 days. It was relatively short because both sides were able to come to a conclusion. JFK, as I said, put this naval blockade. He also threatened to invade Cuba. As we said, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest that the two nations came to nuclear war, and it was basically kind of a contest to see who would blink first or who would do something first. And this became known as brinkmanship, the idea that they were on the brink of war. Ultimately, Khrushchev decides to back down. There was a lot of communication between the Soviet Union and the United States. JFK, his younger brother, Bobby Kennedy, or Robert Kennedy, was his attorney general at the time, and he had a lot of played a big role in the negotiations and kind of trying to cool the situation off. But ultimately, Khrushchev does back down, and he dismantles those missiles in Cuba. The United States had to give up something as well. We also had missiles that were actually aimed at Russia stationed in Turkey, and so we agreed that if they got rid of the missiles in Cuba, we would get rid of the missiles in Turkey. And they actually also created a special hotline with this red phone that was set up that if there was another situation that came close to this, they would be able to communicate faster from the White House to the nation's capital, Soviet Union's capital of Moscow. And as you can see in this picture here, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy do meet together and discuss a few things post-Cuban Missile Crisis. Unfortunately, in November of 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He was there campaigning for his re-election with his wife, Jackie Kennedy. They were with the governor of Texas and his wife, and they were driving through just kind of a short parade, and unfortunately, he was assassinated from a sniper. Quickly, they rushed him to the hospital where he is unfortunately pronounced dead, and his Vice President Lyndon Johnson becomes sworn in on Air Force One, as you can see here in the picture, to become the next president. LBJ, as he becomes known, his domestic agenda was known as the Great Society, and his big goals of that were to create more opportunities and to improve the quality of life for all Americans. He declared a war on poverty. He wanted to expand education, health care for the elderly, and he really wants to work to help with civil rights, which you would have seen in the Civil Rights Movement assignment that you completed. This time period was also about the youth culture. The baby boomers that were born in the 1940s and 50s were turning 20, and so they are becoming young adults that are rebelling against their parents and becoming, what this nation was all about. They are strongly influenced by scenes on television, by the post-war prosperity after World War II, and just enjoying life as a teenager and into their mid-20s. Some of them adopted a spirit of rebellion. They objected this idea of conformity. They wanted to object to a materialistic lifestyle. They call it the establishment or the man. They also were really affected by music, and we see that in fashion, we see it in new hairstyles, we see that with experimentation with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The Beatles from the UK were heavily prevalent in the United States. They were very influential with their styles and their haircuts and things like that. Lastly, we want to talk about the beginning of the Vietnam War with the 1960s. If we back up in time just a little bit, Vietnam was a former colony of France. And in 1954, the man pictured here, Ho Chi Minh, decided with a group of Vietnamese nationalists to rebel or revolt against that French imperialism. And so they are victorious and they are no longer a colony of the French. Something is set up known as the Geneva Conference, and they decided to divide Vietnam into two nations, North and South Vietnam. The North was controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, and the South became a pro-Western nation that was supported by the United States. So while JFK was in office before his assassination, he believed that in what became known as the domino theory. And this is something that had been around for quite some time, throughout the entire Cold War. The idea of the domino theory was that if one nation were to fall to communism, the surrounding countries would also fall to communism. And again, under that policy of containment, it was very important to the United States to contain communism and not to let these nations fall. That's one of the biggest reasons for why we got involved in the Vietnam War, as well as the Korean War. JFK also felt that the same rule of the domino theory could be applied to democracy and to spread it. So if one nation adopted democracy, the rest might fall in line. And so we wanted to spread those ideals. Once LBJ becomes president, the United States becomes more involved in the Vietnam conflict. He orders massive bombing raids, increases the number of troops. By 1968, we had over 500,000 troops stationed in South Vietnam. And as you can see by this graph here, that's probably the highest we get, but still totals are still very, very high during this war. We also get new weapons during the Vietnam War, two of the biggest ones being napalm and Agent Orange. Napalm was a very flammable gasoline that was sticky like jelly that would burn at very high temperatures, and it was used to basically level the vegetation throughout the country of Vietnam to expose the enemy. Agent Orange was also used, and basically this was a way of clearing that vegetation as well. So Vietnam was kind of in a tropical location, very dense jungles, and so by using this chemical, they could clear those jungles out in order to see enemy positions. We'll talk more about the Vietnam War when we get into the 1970s. So this is just a short preview into how it played out with the presidencies of JFK and LBJ. As I said, we'll talk more about that in the next presentation. Thank you for watching, and be sure to enter this into your interactive notebook.